This is an adult story hour. Now, it doesn't like my connection. Hold on. I'm going to another room. Come with me. Here we go. Usually works well from there, but let's see if I go closer this way. How's that? Seems to like that. Maybe I can get a little setup going here. Sorry, it's going to take me a second. Not too long. One more second. Hold on. How's that? Am I live still? Yeah. Good. I had it's a low seat. I had to go turn off the Pandora. We leave it on for the birds during the day because they miss all of you and all the kids. So we put Pandora on. So I'm kind of close to the birds, so you might hear them. That'll be okay. That'll be fun. And I might be crooked because I'm working at a table that has a bunch of nice stuff on it. I find myself working in all different parts of the building these days. I kind of like that part. Welcome. This is Frankenstein Tea, afternoon check-in, daily, every day at 3. Listen anytime you want, always up on our YouTube page. You can listen to this one. You can listen to past ones, find one that you like. Maybe there's a few that you like. Maybe I haven't read a story that you like yet, but hang in there. Maybe I will. I try to read a variety of stories. But today I'm reading from the same book that I read from yesterday. I've had a really busy morning, and so I didn't have time to really scout around too much. I mean, I have some things lined up for other readings, but I didn't want to go anywhere else today in the reading selections. And I heard from my mom that she loved the story yesterday after I prefaced that book saying I wasn't sure that I loved them. And I think it could be generational, but that's okay, right? You've heard me say before, it's not all about me and what I read and what I would read or what I choose to read. Librarianship is about what the patrons want to read. And so I'm reading a second story today from Fires by Raymond Carver. It's Fires, Essays, Poems, Stories by Raymond Carver. And I, when I go to look for stories to read, I usually read a few within a book to myself and sort of ruminate on them and then decide what I'm going to do. And I read this one yesterday, and so here we are. We're back at it again today. So I'm going to have a sip of tea. Does everybody have something nice to drink? How's everybody's day going? Everybody feeling okay today? Every day's different. Always every day's different. But I find that in COVID, in this COVID time, can be really, can change all the time. So this is a time for you to sit back and let me read to you. This story is called The Cabin. Mr. Harold came out of the cafe to find it stopped snowing. The sky was clearing behind the hills on the other side of the river. He stopped beside the car for a minute and stretched, holding the door open while he drew a big mouthful of cold air. He'd swear he could almost taste this air. He eased in behind the steering wheel and got back on the highway. It was only an hour's drive to the lodge. He could get in a couple of hours of fishing this afternoon. Then there was tomorrow, all day tomorrow. At Park Junction, he took the bridge over the river and turned off onto the road that would take him to the lodge. Pine trees whose branches were heavy with snow stood on either side of the road. Clouds mantled the white hills so that it was hard to tell where the hills ended and the sky began. It reminded him of those Chinese landscapes they looked at that time in the museum in Portland. He liked them. He said as much to Frances, but she didn't say anything back. She'd spent a few minutes with him in that wing of the gallery and then moved on to the next exhibit. It was going on noon when he reached the lodge. He saw the cabins up on the hill, and then, as the road straightened out, the lodge itself. He slowed, bumped off the road onto the dirty, sand-covered parking lot, and stopped the car up close to the front door. He rolled down the window and rested for a minute, working his shoulders back and forth into the seat. He closed and then opened his eyes. A flickering neon sign said Castle Rock, and below that, on a neat hand-painted sign, Deluxe Cabins, Office. The last time he'd been here, Francis had been with him that time. They'd stayed for 4 days, and he landed 5 nice fish downriver. That had been 3 years ago. They used to come here often, 2 or 3 times a year. He opened the door and got out of the car slowly, feeling the stiffness in his back and neck. He walked heavily across the frozen snow and stuck his hands in his coat pockets as he started up the plank steps. At the top, he scraped the snow and grit off his shoes and nodded to a young couple coming out. He noticed the way the man held the woman's arms as they went down the steps. Inside the lodge, there was the smell of wood smoke and fried ham. He heard the clatter of dishes. He looked at the big brown trout mounted over the fireplace in the dining room, and he felt glad to be back. Near the cash register where he stood was a display case with leather purses, wallets, and pairs of moccasins arranged behind the glass. Scattered on top of the case were Indian bead necklaces and bracelets and pieces of petrified wood. He moved over to the horseshoe-shaped counter and took a stool. 2 men sitting a few stools down stopped talking and turned their heads to look at him. They were hunters, and their red hats and coats lay on an empty table behind them. Mr. Harrell waited and pulled at his fingers. "How long you been here?" the girl asked, frowning. She'd come on him soundlessly from the kitchen. She put down a glass of water in front of him. "Not long," Mr. Harold said. "You should have rung the bell," she said. Her braces glittered as she opened and closed her mouth. "I'm supposed to have a cabin," he said. "I wrote you a card and made a reservation a week or so ago." "I'll have to get Mrs. May," the girl said. "She's cooking. She's the one who looks after the cabins. She didn't say anything to me about it. We don't usually keep them open in the winter, you know." "I wrote you a card," he said. "You check with Mrs. May. You ask her about it." The 2 men had turned on their stools to look at him again. "I'll get Mrs. May," the girl said. Flushed, he closed his hands together on the counter in front of him. A big Frederick Remington reproduction hung on the wall at the far end of the room. He watched the lurching, frightened buffalo and the Indians with the drawn bows fixed at their shoulders. "Mr. Harold," the woman called, hobbling toward him. She was a small, gray-haired woman with heavy breasts and a fat throat. The straps to her underwear showed through her white uniform. She undid her apron and held out her hand. "Glad to see you, Mrs. May," he said as he got up off the stool. "I hardly recognized you," the old woman said. "I don't know what's the matter with the girl sometimes. Edith, she's my granddaughter. My granddaughter and her husband are looking after the place now." She took her glasses off and began wiping away the steam from the lenses. He looked down at the polished counter. He smoothed his fingers over the grainy wood. "Where's the missus?" she asked. "She didn't feel too well this week," Mr. Harrell said. He started to say something else, but there was nothing else to say. "I'm sorry to hear that. I had the cabin fixed up nice for the 2 of you," Mrs. May said. She took off the apron and put it behind the cash register. "Edith, I'm taking Mr. Harold to his cabin. I'll have to get my coat, Mr. Harold." The girl didn't answer, but she came to the kitchen door with a coffee pot in her hand and stared at them. Outside, the sun had come out and the glare hurt his eyes. He held on to the banister and went slowly down the stairs, following Mrs. May, who limped. "Sun's bad, isn't it?" she said, moving carefully over the packed snow. He felt she ought to be using a cane. The first time it's been out all week, she said. She waved at some people going by in a car. They went past a gasoline pump, locked and covered with snow, and past a little shed with a tires sign hung over the door. He looked through the broken windows at the heaps of burlap sacks inside, the old tires, and the barrels. The room was damp and cold looking. Snow had drifted inside and lay sprinkled on the sill around the broken glass. Kids have done that, Mrs. May said, stopping for a minute and putting her hand up to the broken window. They don't miss a chance to do us dirt. A whole pack of them are all the time running wild from down at the construction camp. She shook her head. Poor little devils. Sorry home life for kids anyway, always on the move like that. Their daddies are building on that dam. She unlocked the cabin door and pushed on it. I laid a little fire this morning, so it would be nice for you, she said. I appreciate that, Mrs. May, he said. There was a big double bed covered with a plain bedspread, a bureau, and a desk in the front room, which was divided from the kitchen by a little plywood partition. There was also a sink, wood stove, wood box, an old ice box, an oilcloth covered table, and 2 wooden chairs. A door opened to a bathroom. He saw a little porch to one side where he could hang his clothes. Looks fine, he said. I tried to make it as nice as I could, she said. Do you need anything now, Mr. Harold? Not now, anyway. Thanks, he said. I'll let you rest then. You're probably tired driving all that way, she said. I should bring in my things, Mr. Harold said, following her out. He shut the door behind them, and they stood on the porch, looking down the hill. I'm just sorry your wife couldn't come, the old woman said. He didn't answer. From where they stood, they were almost on a level with the huge rock protruding from the hillside behind the road. Some people said it looked like a petrified castle. How's the fishing? He said. Some of them are getting fish, but most of the men are out hunting, she said. Deer season, you know. He drove the car as close as he could to the cabin and started to unload. The last thing he took out of the car was a pint of scotch from the glove compartment. He set the bottle on the table. Later, as he spread out the boxes of weights and hooks and thick-bodied red and white flies, he moved the bottle to the drain board. Sitting there at the table, smoking a cigarette with his tackle box open and everything in its place, his flies and the weights spread out, testing leader strength against his hands and trying upfits for that afternoon, he was glad he'd come after all. And he'd still be able to get in a couple of hours fishing this afternoon. Then there was tomorrow. He'd already decided he would save some of the bottle for when he came back from fishing that afternoon and have the rest for tomorrow. As he sat at the table tying up outfits, he thought he heard something digging out on the porch. He got up from the table and opened the door, but there was nothing there. There was only the white hills and the dead-looking pines under the overcast sky, and down below, the few buildings and some cars drawn up beside the highway. He was all at once very tired and thought he would lie down on the bed for a few minutes. He didn't want to sleep. He'd just lie down and rest, and then he'd get up, dress, take his things, and walk down to the river. He cleaned off the table, undressed, and then got in between the cold sheets. For a while, he lay on his side, eyes closed, knees drawn up for warmth. Then he turned onto his back and wiggled his toes against the sheet. He wished Francis were here. He wished there was somebody to talk to. He opened his eyes. The room was dark. The stove gave off little crackling noises, and there was a red glow on the wall behind the stove. He lay in bed and stared out the window, not able to believe it was really dark outside. He shut his eyes again and then opened them. He'd only wanted to rest. He hadn't intended to fall asleep. He opened his eyes and sat up heavily on the side of the bed. He got on his shirt and reached for his pants. He went into the bathroom and threw water on his face. God damn it, he said, banging things around in the kitchen cupboard, taking down some cans and putting them back up again. He made a pot of coffee and drank 2 cups before deciding to go down to the cafe for something to eat. He put on wool slippers and a coat and hunted around until he found his flashlight. Then he went outside. The cold air stung his cheeks and pinched his nostrils together, but the air felt good to him. It cleared his head. The lights from the lodge showed him where he was walking, and he was careful. Inside the cafe, he nodded to the girl, Edith, and sat down in a booth near the end of the counter. He could hear a radio playing back in the kitchen. The girl made no effort to wait on him. Are you closed? Mr. Harold said. Kind of. I'm cleaning up for the morning, she said. Too late for something to eat then, he said. I guess I can get you something, she said. She came over with a menu. Mrs. May around, Edith? She's up in her room. Do you need her for something? I need more wood for in the morning. It's out and back, she said, right here behind the kitchen. Now the light went off. Hold on. Motion lights. So, it's out and back, she said, right here behind the kitchen. He pointed to something simple on the menu, a ham sandwich with potato salad. I'll have this, he said. As he waited, he began moving the salt and pepper shakers around in a little circle in front of him. After she brought his plate to him, she hung around out in front, filling sugar bowls and napkin holders, looking up at him from time to time. Pretty soon, before he'd finished, she came over with a wet rag and began wiping off his table. He left some money, considerably more than the bill, and went out through a side door at the side of the lodge. When he went around back where he picked up an armload of wood. Then the snail's pace climbed up to the cabin. He looked back once and saw the girl watching him from the kitchen window. By the time he got to his door and dropped the wood, he hated her. He lay on the bed for a long time and read old Life magazines that he'd found on the porch. When the heat from the fire finally made him sleepy, he got up and cleared off his bed, then arranged his things for the next morning. He looked through the pile of stuff again to make sure he had everything. He liked things in order and didn't want to get up the next morning and have to look for something. He picked up the scotch and held the bottle up to the light. Then he poured some into a cup. He carried the cup over to the bed and set it on the nightstand. He turned off the light and stood looking out the window for a minute before getting into bed. He got up so early it was still almost dark in the cabin. The fire had gone down to coals during the night. He could see his breath in the cabin. He adjusted the grate and pushed in some wood. He couldn't remember the last time he'd gotten up so early. He fixed peanut butter sandwiches and wrapped them in wax paper. He put the sandwiches and some oatmeal cookies into a coat pocket. At the door, he pulled on his waders. The light outside was vague and gray. Clouds filled the long valleys and hung in patches over the trees and mountains. The lodge was dark. He moved out slowly down the packed, slippery trail toward the river. It pleased him to be up this early and to be going fishing. Somewhere in one of the valleys off behind the river, he heard the pop-pop of shots and counted them. 7, 8. The hunters were awake. And the deer. He wondered if the shots came from the 2 hunters he'd seen in the lodge yesterday. Deer didn't have much of a chance in snow like this. He kept his eyes down, watching the trail. It kept dropping downhill, and soon he was in heavy timber with snow up to his ankles. Snow lay in drifts under the trees, but it wasn't too deep where he walked. It was a good trail, packed solid, thick with pine needles that crunched in the snow under his boots. He could see his breath streaming out in front of him. He held the fishing rod straight ahead of him when he had to push through the bushes or go under trees with low limbs. He held the rod by its big reel tucked up under his arm like a lance. Sometimes, when he was a kid and had gone into the remote area to fish for 2 or 3 days at a time, hiking in by himself, he carried his rod like this, even when there was no brush or trees, maybe just a big green meadow. Those times he would imagine himself waiting for his opponent to ride out of the trees on a horse. The jays at the crowded edge of the woods would scream. Then he'd sing something as loud as he could, yell defiance until his chest hurt at the hawks that circled and circled over the meadow. The sun and the sky came back to him now, and the lake with the lean-to. The water was so clear and green you could see 15 or 20 feet down to where it shelved off into deeper water. He could hear the river. But the trail was gone now, and just before he started down the bank to the river, he stepped into a snowdrift up over his knees and panicked, clawing up handfuls of snow and vines to get out. The river looked impossibly cold. It was silver green in color, and there was ice on the little pools in the rocks along the edge. Before, in the summer, he caught his fish further downriver, but he couldn't go downriver this morning. This morning, he was simply glad to be where he was. 100 feet away on the other side of the river lay a beach with a nice rifle running just in front of the beach. That could be riffle, 2 F's, riffle, with a nice riffle running just in front of the beach. But of course, there was no way getting over there. He decided he was just fine where he was. He lifted up onto a log, positioned himself there, and looked around. He saw tall trees and snow-covered mountains. He thought it was pretty as a picture, the way the steam lay over the river. He sat there on the log, swinging his legs back and forth while he threaded the line through the guides of his rod. He tied on one of the outfits he'd made up last night. When everything was ready, he slipped down off the log, pulled the rubber boots up over his legs as high as they'd go, and fastened the buckle tops of the waders to his belt. He waded slowly into the river, holding his breath for the cold water shock. The water hit and, swirling, braced against him up to his knees. He stopped, then he moved a little further. He took the brake off his reel and made a nice cast upstream. As he fished, he began to feel some of the old excitement coming back. He kept on fishing. After a time, he waded out and sat down on a rock with his back against a log. He took out the cookies. He wasn't going to hurry anything. Not today. A flock of small birds flew from across the river and perched on some rocks close to where he was sitting. They rose when he scattered a handful of crumbs toward them. The tops of the trees creaked, and the wind was drawing the clouds up out of the valley and over the hills. Then he heard a spatter of shots from somewhere in the forest across the river. He just changed flies and made his cast when he saw the deer. It stumbled out of the brush upriver and ran into the little beach, shaking and twisting its head, ropes of white mucus hanging from its nostrils. Its left hind leg was broken and dragged behind as, for an instant, the deer stopped and turned her head back to look at it. Then she went into the river and out into the current, until her back and head were visible. She reached the shallow water on his side and came out clumsily, moving her head from side to side. He stood very still and watched her plunge into the trees. "Dirty bastards," he said. He made another cast. Then he reeled in and made his way back to the shore. He sat down in the same place on the log and ate his sandwich. It was dry and didn't have any taste to it, but he ate it anyway and tried not to think about the deer. Francis would be up now, doing things around the house. He didn't want to think about Francis either. But he remembered that morning when he'd caught the three steelhead. It was all he could do to carry them up the hill to their cabin. But he had, and when she came to the door, he'd emptied them out of the sack onto the steps in front of her. She'd whistled and bent down to touch the black spots that ran along their backs. And he'd gone back after that afternoon and caught two more. It had turned colder. The wind was blowing down the river. He got up stiffly and hobbled over the rocks, trying to loosen up. He thought about building a fire, but then decided he wouldn't stay much longer. Some crows flapped by overhead, coming from across the river. When they were over him, he yelled, but they didn't even look down. He changed flies again, added more weight, and cast upstream. He let the current draw the line through his fingers until he saw it go slack. Then he set the brake on his reel. The pencil-lead weight bounced against the rocks under the water. He held the butt of the rod against his stomach and wondered how the fly might look to a fish. Several boys came out of the trees upriver and walked onto the beach. Some of them were wearing red hats and down vests. They moved around on the beach, looking at Mr. Harold and then looking up and down the river. When they began moving down the beach in his direction, Mr. Harold looked up at the hills, then downriver to where the best water was. He began to reel in. He caught his fly and set the hook into the cork above the reel. Then he started easing his way back toward the shore, thinking only of the shore and that each careful step brought him one step closer. Hey! He stopped and turned slowly around in the water, wishing this thing had happened when he was on the shore and not out here with the water pushing against his legs and him off balance on the slippery rocks. His feet wedged themselves down between rocks while he kept his eyes on them until he picked out the leader. All of them wore what looked like holsters or knife sheaths on their belts. But only one boy had a rifle. It was, he knew, the boy who called to him. Gaunt and thin-faced, wearing a brown duck-billed cap, the boy said, "You see a deer come out up there?" The boy held the gun in his right hand as if it were a pistol and pointed the barrel up the beach. One of the boys said, "Sure he did, Earl. It ain't been very long," and looked around at the four others. They nodded. They passed around a cigarette and kept their eyes on him. I said, "Hey, you deaf?" I said, "Did you see him?" It wasn't a him. It was a her, Mr. Harold said, and her back leg was almost shot off for Christ's sake. "What's that to you?" the one with the gun said. "He's pretty smart, ain't he, Earl? Tell us where it went, you old son of a bitch," one of the boys said. "Where'd he go?" the boy asked and raised the gun to his hip, half pointing it across at Mr. Harold. "Who wants to know?" He held the rod straight ahead, tight up under his arm, and with his other hand he pulled down his hat. "You little bastards are from the trailer camp up the river, aren't you?" "You think you know a lot, don't you?" the boy said, looking around him at the others, nodding at them. He raised up one foot and set it down slowly, then the other. In a moment, he raised the rifle to his shoulder and pulled back the hammer. The barrel was pointed at Mr. Harold's stomach, or else a little lower down. The water swirled and foamed around his boots. He opened and closed his mouth, but he was not able to move his tongue. He looked down into the clear water at the rocks and the little spaces of sand. He wondered what it would be like if his boots tipped water and he went down, rolling like a chunk. "What's the matter with you?" he asked the boy. The ice water came up through his legs then and poured into his chest. The boy didn't say anything. He just stood there. All of them just stood there looking at him. "Don't shoot," Mr. Harold said. The boy held the gun on him for another minute, then he lowered it. "Scared, wasn't you?" Mr. Harold nodded his head dreamily. He felt as if he wanted to yawn. He kept opening and closing his mouth. One of the boys pried loose a rock from the edge of the water and threw it. Mr. Harold turned his back and the rock hit the water 2 feet away from him. The others began throwing. He stood there looking at the shore, hearing the rocks splash around him. "You didn't want to fish here anyway, did you?" the boy said. "I could have got you, but I didn't. You see that deer? You remember how lucky you was?" Mr. Harold stood there a minute longer. Then he looked over his shoulder. One of the boys gave him the finger, and the rest of them grinned. Then they moved together back into the trees. He watched them go. He turned and worked his way back to the shore and dropped down against the log. After a few minutes, he got up and started the walk back to the cabin. The snow had held back all morning, and now, just as he was in sight of the clearing, light flakes began falling. His rod was back there somewhere. Maybe he'd left it when he stopped that one time after he turned his ankle. He could remember laying the rod on the snow as he tried to undo his boot, but he couldn't recall picking it up. Anyway, it didn't matter to him now. It was a good rod and one that he'd paid over $90 for one summer 5 or 6 years ago. But even if it were nice tomorrow, he wouldn't go back for it. Tomorrow? He had to go back home and at work tomorrow. A jay cried from a nearby tree, and another answered from across the clearing by his cabin. He was tired and walking slowly by now, trying to keep weight off his foot. He came out of the trees and stopped. Lights were on down at the lodge. Even the lights in the parking area were on. There were still many hours of daylight left, but they had turned on all of the lights down there. This seemed mysterious and impenetrable to him. Had something happened? He shook his head. Sorry. Even the lights in the parking area were on. There were still many hours of daylight left, but they had turned on all the lights down there. This seemed mysterious and impenetrable to him. Had something happened? He shook his head. Then he went up the steps to his cabin. He stopped on the porch. He didn't want to go inside, but he understood he had to open the door and enter the room. He didn't know if he could do that. He thought for a minute of just getting into his car and driving away. He looked once more down the hill at the lights. Then he grasped the doorknob and opened the door to his cabin. Someone, Mrs. May, he supposed, had built a little fire in the stove. Still, he looked around cautiously. It was quiet except for the sizzling of the fire. He sat down on the bed and began to work off his boots. Then he sat there in his stocking feet, thinking of the river and of the large fish that must even now be moving upriver in that heart-stopping cold water. He shook his head, got up, and held his hands a few inches from the stove, opening and closing his fingers until they tingled. He let the warmth gradually come back into his body. He began to think of home, of getting back there before dark. That was The Cabin by Raymond Carver from a book called Fires. I hope the birds weren't totally distracting. That's why we leave the radio on for them. They're real yackers. And this is also why I don't usually read in this room. I had the lights are, motion detected, and it can't see me here when I'm in this corner. But I hope we all made it through that story. As I said in the beginning, I do pre-read everything, and so to any of my family that's listening, of course that one's for Uncle Bob. Okay, everybody. My dad says, oh, he's making Swiss bread. Oh, yummy, Dad. That's great. You're going to put some honey butter on that? I taught James honey butter the other day, Dad. I'm going to finish my tea. I'm going to finish up my day at work, and I'm going to start to look for something to read tomorrow. Thanks for coming to Frankenstein Tea. Have a great afternoon. Everybody stay in, stay well, stay strong, and I'll see you soon. Peace.